infrastructure that's going to not even serve the next decade.
So was this, how much was spent on this in 2018?
Unsure of how much we actually spent, but we will look into it for you, and maybe at break if we can bring the information back at that time.
Well, I think maybe at this point we should table it for more information, not only how much we spent, but how much was recovered from developers last year, if any.
Councillor Columbus.
Yeah, so Mayor Chop, we've relied on consultants to get us the modeling, so we know what we've got, but we certainly have the expertise in-house to apply those models and to see how all this comes together. So, you know, now that we've got the information in place, we're able to utilize it in-house.
Mayor Chop.
The $35,000 is an outside fee, correct? This is being paid to a consultant, essentially.
That's what is proposed in this budget, yeah.
Any further discussion? So I'm going to, oh, sorry, Councillor Van Passen, my apologies.
Thank you. I'll try again. Can we fund it out of the rate stabilization reserve since we have a projected profit of $433,000 on last year's operations? Is that legal, legitimate? And I don't think the question is whether it should be done. Its question is where the money comes from, and we need to identify where the money comes from. So it's either going to come from the ratepayers of the services, it's going to come from development charge reserve, or it's got to come from the tax levy, or it's got to come out of, you know, they did well last year, they got a little bit of money left over, that goes into reserve. Let's fund this year's special sort of initiative out of the savings we had last year.
Mayor Chop.
I think we need more information. We need how much money was recovered last year, how much actually how much was spent last year, how much was recovered last year, how much is going to be used, estimated by the ratepayers, how much is going to be used by the development community, how much is going to be charged to the development community to use this service. I can't approve myself $35,000 to the ratepayers without any of that information being provided today.
Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So if I can make a suggestion, I know there's a motion on the floor. However, I think you have some options. One, you could vote on the motion and it's gone, and then we can't. That's done. The other option you have is what you alluded to is we could come back with more information with a report to council, and we'd be able to maybe look into Councillor Van Passen's inquiries on some funding and items like that, and we can perhaps have more of a discussion at a future date.
Mayor Chop.
Through the chair to the clerk, at this point we could just, I don't even believe we would have to move for deferral, it would just be to move for more information, to defer this item for more information.
Through you, Madam Chair, at this point we do have the motion on the floor, so we're required to deal with the motion on the floor. Deferral always takes precedence, so if it's always appropriate to defer for more information. So if the member, Mayor Chop, desires to move a motion of deferral, that would trump her existing motion, if that assists.
It does. Okay, so at this moment then I'll move for deferral.
Councillor Columbus.
I was just going to ask, is there any debate for deferral or not, Mr. Clerk?
Through you, yes, there is. So you can debate the merits of deferral just in the aspect of that. But you're correct that a period, our procedural bylaw was out of step with Robert's rules. So about 2 years ago, there wouldn't be any debate except on the time frame.
Councillor Columbus.
I do not accept the fact that we should be deferring a great percentage of the stuff that's coming before this council, because that's just delaying things. And it actually, I look at it upon as increasing red tape. I think we heard that there's been significant recent growth from Mr. Baird. He says this is a critical need for the county. And I'd sooner, he did say that perhaps he doesn't need all the $35,000. I would say that if we gave him $17,500, and that would eliminate $17,500 out of the budget, that would work. And I'd like to hear from Mr. Baird if he feels that would be suffice.
Or, at this point, if we're debating, is it not, we're in debate, this isn't a question and answer period anymore.
Mr. Griselle.
To assist, the chair has to deal with the point of order before I can.
Point of order, if we're in a debate, is the question and answer period finished? Mr. Griselle.
So there's a couple of issues. Right now, there isn't actually a deferral on the floor because it hasn't been seconded. So the main motion on the new council initiative would still be on the floor. But if we're debating the merits of the deferral or not, it's appropriate for staff to, council members to ask staff for information pertinent to that.
Okay, so at this point, I'm going to ask for a seconder for the deferral based on the fact that we're new council, and I think the more information that we can receive, the better. So is there a seconder, Mr. Michelli, Councillor Michelli? Thank you. Further discussion? I'm working on it here. A little help from the clerk would be most appreciated.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Councillor, could you please repeat that question? Through Mayor Chop, we put our budgets together with what we think we need to operate, but we recognize the challenges, the financial challenges. I think that's certainly a reasonable amount that will help us do perhaps the priority areas that we need to do. We won't be able to do as much, but we can still get some of that information obtained, and then we're able to use it. So that's a reasonable.
Mayor Chop.
Councillor Columbus, yesterday you were the most vocal against the freezing the holding tank increase, and driving in here this morning I heard on the radio the argument that you made that we now, as the ratepayers, the residential ratepayers, were going to be subsidizing the holding tank and septic tank users, which I don't believe to be an accurate description. However, based on this report, what's presented in front of us and the justification that the staff feels that this is an added value to the development, that the county has been offering charged back to the developer at no cost, or at our cost rather, to have the consultant run the model to assist developers in their submissions. There has been absolutely no justification provided by staff, no ROI, no line item that shows the revenue that was brought in from development, and no line item that shows a service charge and how this is going to be charged back to the developers. So I would argue in this case that we, the ratepayers, would be subsidizing the development community. And for that reason, I would request more information.
Madam Chair, Deputy Mayor, I stand with my original thinking that single-family residences in the major urban centers are subsidizing holding tank rates. You got to remember there's a 2-point-some% increase, I believe it is, for everybody, all the water users, and yet the holding tank residents, property owners, got a 0% increase. Thank you.
Councillor Van Passen?
Quite the discussion, but in the back of my head, I keep thinking, we get hired to make decisions once in a while, and we have to move on. We can't keep setting off little things. There's a motion on the floor to defer. We should vote on it. That will either pass or fail. Once that is done, if it fails, we go back to the original motion. That will either pass or fail, and another motion would be in order, but I would ask that we call the question and move on. Thank you.
Okay, any further discussion before we move to vote on the deferral? To defer for additional information? Okay, those in favor of deferral? And those against? Motion's defeated. We'll return to the original motion, which I'll ask the clerk one final time to repeat.
That the new council initiative of $35,000 be removed from the rate budget.
And we go back to discussion on that. Councillor Michelli?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a procedural question for the clerk. Were we not supposed to vote on Councillor Van Passen's motion to call the question in our previous vote?
Mr.
I believe he said he wanted to call the question.
Through you, Madam Chair. It's interesting. First time I've had that query here at Norfolk County Council, but it is a good one. Certainly you can call the question, but in order to call the question, all first-time speakers need to be exhausted. So I believe there are some councillors who've not spoken to this issue yet, so it's at the discretion of the chair to determine whether everybody's had an opportunity to speak and whether or not to vote on the calling of the question.
So does that mean that those councillors who didn't get an opportunity to speak can speak now?
Through the chair, yes. You'd have an opportunity to speak at least once on every item before the question is called, if you so desire. But if you don't, then we proceed directly to the question.
Then through you, Madam Chair. I would speak in favor of deferral on the motion that we have already, I guess, voted on, because we are all brand new councillors with the exception of two of us, and with all due respect to them. They're much more familiar with this process. Most of us are not, and I just think more information on all of this will help everybody, and then people will be much more familiar with what it is we're actually doing here. So I hope that we can now, and Madam Chair, this is another question for the clerk. So are we allowed then now to vote again on the motion of deferral, assuming that no other councillors have questions or comments?
It would depend upon, usually if you're saying that the outcome of the vote was lacking because of your input, because you weren't given the procedural ability to speak before the deferral was voted on, then that would be a ruling for the chair. I mean, we could go immediately right now. I think the big thing is to get on past this and decide. So even if council wants to go ahead, if the quickest way to get through that might just be to do another vote quickly.
Okay, thank you, because the reason I'm asking about this is that I wanted to get the Deputy Mayor's attention to ask if we needed to have a vote on Councillor Van Passen calling the question. She didn't see me, and so I didn't get an opportunity, and the next thing we're doing is voting.
My apologies to Councillor Michelli. Would anyone else like to speak that I have missed? No further discussion. So at this point, again, I would call to vote on the deferral. Those in favor? And those opposed? Motion is defeated. Thank you. So we're back to the original motion. Further discussion on that, or do we go directly into a vote?
You can see if any further speakers are.
Okay, any further comments on the original motion? Councillor Columbus?
Original motion repeated, please.
So that the new council initiative of $35,000 be removed from the rate budget.
Mr. Clerk, would it be, is it right for me to make an amendment to that, to say that it be reduced by 17,500 to 17,500, which is 50%? Am I in order?
It depends upon the intention of the mover, which would be Mayor Chop, in that respect, because you can't negate the intent of the motion. So if it's if the amendment negates the intent, then it is. So if the desire from the mayor was to have it funded through an entirely different source, then that would negate it. But if it was just to reduce the overall budget complement, then you could say, okay, well, this isn't as much of a reduction, but it's a smaller reduction. So it depends. It's something that the chair would have to ask the mayor.
Mayor Chop, any comments?
Pointed out so that it can be funded from a different source. We have no line item in the budget that shows the revenue that staff claims to have received from the development community. So I reiterate my original point. Ratepayers should not be subsidizing new home development, and without seeing a user fee or a service charge included in the budget report, that means the entire amount currently, with no revenue line being implemented from that, is being funded by the ratepayers. So it would stand to have it removed. I'm not discounting that it may be a very valuable tool, and if it has to be charged back to water and waste at some point, that may very well be. But right now I see it as benefiting in this description that was provided under the justification as benefiting the development community.
Further discussion on this motion before we move to vote? Okay, those in favor? And those opposed? The motion is defeated. Councillor Columbus.
Can I now put my motion on the floor with respect to the net levy impact would be $17,500 or 50% rather than the $35,000?
Seconder? Mayor Chop? Councillor Columbus?
I'd like to ask staff, with respect to that question, what their thoughts are on that addition.
Mayor Chop, that's not a problem at all. The user fee would be 100% cost recovery. So generally, a developer would approach the county, the consultant that would do that analysis or provide that information. They don't like to deal directly with a third party. They deal with the county. So we pay their bill, and then we collect from the developer 100% of those fees. If council wanted to add an additional fee onto that for that service, that's something we could look at. But as long as we receive 100% back for those costs, we're protecting our ratepayers and we're achieving the results that we need.
Madam Mayor, we are on the same page, so I concur with your request. Thank you.
Mayor Chop?
Absolutely, and through the user fee process, we have the ability to calculate out those additional or ancillary costs to set the rate. So we will do that and amend the user fee bylaw accordingly.
Mr. Johnson?
Thank you, Madam Chair. If I can make a suggestion, we're already bringing a report back dealing with user fees in February. Perhaps that would be an opportune time to bring that fee, if Mr. Baird agrees with that. That way it's all in one report. And we were talking about user fees anyway, so we can just add that on to it.
Councillor Van Passen?
Thank you, Madam Chair. To ask the mover, are you proposing to reduce the number of 35,000, or are you proposing to add the offsetting 17.5 as revenue at the bottom?
Well, my suggestion was to remove 17,500 from the proposed net levy impact. And then we've got, the mayor has added, I guess it's what we call a user fee, developer fee, right? Yeah, it's fine with me as long as it's covered off that, yeah.
Mayor Chop?
If I understand what you're saying correctly, is you're saying keep the 35, but split it with a 17.5 recovery. I don't believe there would be a 17,500 recovery, because the point is we're simply, right now, all that's happening is we're paying the bill to the consultant. So we're not generating any revenue off of that. We're just eliminating that 17,500. The revenue, the portion of revenue from a user fee would be that portion for staff time to actually go and deal with the consulting company and negotiate that with the developer. So to say at this point that we would be able to bring in 17,500 from the development community as a user or service charge, I think would be, without knowing any more information about how much time, that would be, I think, quite a bit in staff time, 17,500 being spent on that. I think Councillor Columbus's original motion to reduce it by 17,500 would be the more appropriate thing to do.
I concur with the mayor's last comment. Thanks.
Councillor Roberts?
I would like for the motion that we're presently debating, considering to be a recorded vote.
I believe I need a seconder on the motion. Councillor Huffman. And moving forward with additional debate, conversation on this motion. Ready to vote with a recorded vote. I'll pass it over to Mr. Griselle.
Councillor Geisens. Yes. Councillor Rabbits.
Yes.
Yes.
Councillor Columbus.
Yes.
Councillor Martin.
Yes.
Councillor Van Passen. Yes. Councillor Huffman. Yes. Councillor Michele.
Yes.
Councillor Taylor.
Yes.
Mayor Chop.
Yes.
Unanimous.
I'll take the chair back then. We can carry on to the next item. If anybody else has any questions on 3-4. Hopefully they do. Councillor Taylor.
Through you, Madam Mayor, I would like to ask staff if the council-approved initiatives of $250,000 was the line item that was alluded to that could be comfortably cut by $50,000 yesterday.
Madam Mayor, that is correct. To Councillor Taylor.
At this point, I would like to put a motion on the floor to reduce that line item by $50,000, and that line item being the council-approved initiatives.
Councillor Rapids.
I would like to second Councillor Taylor's motion.
Any discussion? Councillor Martin.
This might be a little bit redundant today, but for me, this is another issue that I really would value additional information on. I think we had a conversation about the ORO services, and I don't know where that stands. I know we were waiting for additional information with regards to CUPE. For me, coupled with the fact that we have a new report that we received yesterday that discusses this position and additional savings, I would like to have more information brought back at a later date on this subject. Thank you.
Any further discussion? Councillor Van Passen.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Maybe some staff could help me out on this, but we're trying to approve a budget that is our best guess on revenue and expenses. And since this is a rate supported budget, if we have a rate stabilization fund, if we guessed wrong and we brought in too much money, it goes back into that fund, that stays in that fund to help in future years. If we guessed wrong the other way and we're a little short, then the rate stabilization fund will cover that, but it stays in the ownership of the people who put it there. And you know, we're going to get reports back, but at some point we have to approve something, and we can deal with, if there's adjustments down, like the ORO situation, hopefully we will resolve that over the course of the year. It will save a whole bunch of money. Our estimate on the amount brought in and the amount expended will be different, but the net amount will stay with this group that funded it. So, you know, all these points are good. We'll get reports back over the course of time. We'll deal with it. But at some point, we also have to pass the budget.
So to be clear, we don't have to pass the budget in its entirety. We can pass it in portions. It doesn't have to be, items can be left out with the general approval on the budget. This was supposed to be negotiated by the end of January. That was the extension that we approved in a motion put to staff in December. We have not received an update on the negotiation process. I think even at a $50,000 reduction, that is excessive. Last year, we heard that there was hundreds of thousands of dollars in a surplus. I thought it was only 100, and then we heard, we still didn't really get an exact number from staff. And so while that's great that it goes into a rate stabilization budget, at some point, there has to be a cap of when you have this much of a surplus, some amount of money has to come back to reduce those rates. It can't just keep getting funneled into an account. So I think $50,000, it should be significantly when you look at an uplift on a salary and when a manager would be holding that position during the daytime hours, that is significantly less than $200,000. And again, the budget could be approved with some items being left, this being one, when we agreed that staff would go back and they would have negotiations completed by the end of January. So I don't, myself personally, I don't see that as being an issue to approve the rest of the budget without this one line item. Further discussion. Councillor Columbus.
Yes, Madam Mayor, I heard you say we don't have to pass the budget in its entirety. And I'm just wondering how billing would deal with that. Perhaps Mr. Johnson can clarify that. Normally, we have done that in the past where we've passed it in its entirety. And I know when it comes to the property budgets, like the tax bills, they have to be sent out by a certain date. So hopefully that our budget will be passed by then so that the residents know what their taxes are going to be. So I'd just like to ask Mr. Johnson, how long can we go without passing the budget in its entirety to the rate users of water and sewer?
Through you, Madam Mayor, to Councillor Columbus. First, if I may, I apologize for not getting the surplus numbers to you yesterday. The amount for water is $518,900, and the surplus for wastewater is $428,700. So there's those numbers for your information. Just to touch on the surplus, There's a variety of reasons why there's a surplus, but I think it's mostly attributed to we were going to issue significant debt that year. However, the projects weren't quite complete, so we had some savings in debt charges. To answer Councillor Columbus's question, sorry that I sort of hijacked your question there. However, what I'm interpreting passing the budget partially is passing the budget as is with certain items being deferred or taken out to be discussed at a later time. So those items, let's use the $250,000 as an example. If we decide to not pass that portion of this budget for $250,000, then we will not include that in calculating our rates, because we have to get the rates out there. When we do discuss it at a later time, and we decide to then initiate the $250,000, if it's not funded by a reserve or anything else, if it is funded by the rates, then that will be a variance for that year, and we'll have to at the end of the year, perhaps it'll be made up by other savings, but we'll have to wait and see. But it will be treated as an operating variance.
Thank you for that clarification.
Councillor Martin. Councillor Hoffman, sorry, I didn't see you.
Just seeing who was where. Okay. Is there an amount, I know that typically if we wouldn't have all been a new council, we would have been doing this in December, correct? Okay. Is there a dollar amount as to the lost revenue of not having passed the budget in December and dealing with it now?
Mr. Johnson?
Through you, Madam Mayor, to Councillor Hoffman. So yes, we calculated what our monthly impact would be for delaying, and if we were to, well, let me clarify for a second. We have to generate $18.5 million, whether it's over 12 months, 11 months, or 10 months. So we wouldn't lose the revenue per se. We would just not spread it over 12 months for the users. So the users would end up with higher monthly bills for 10 or 11 months to generate the $18.5 million rather than a lower monthly bill for the 12 months. So at the end of the day, we have to generate the revenue.
Okay.
So it's just a matter of how much it's spread for the users to pay.
Councillor Martin.
If we were to receive additional information at a later date or a later time from you, Mr. Johnson, how soon would you be able to bring us back more information on this $250,000?
Through the mayor to Councillor Martin, that's not a question that I can answer. I can provide dollars, however, there's a lot more behind that.
At this point in time, for me, I feel as though yesterday council made some decisions for the betterment of all of Norfolk County, and it was our intention to fully go into this budget and try and assess where we could find additional savings to make the decisions we made yesterday count for all of Norfolk County, not just the people that we were trying to help out, the water and wastewater individuals. So I think there's no better time than right now, as it is our very first time for 7 council members to go through this information. In no way, shape, or form am I advocating for this to not go forward. I am simply wanting to have all the information in front of me to make the best informed decision I can, and in future years down the road, hope that we can go through this much more swiftly. So at this point in time, I would like to move for a deferral on this.
Any discussions? Councillor Michelli.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I would like to second Councillor Martin's motion.
And any discussion? If I could pass the chair over to Ms. Martin. Last year, so now we have some numbers. We saved $947,600 was a surplus. When we look at an $18 million budget, that's 5.5%. Sorry, half, what am I doing here? Yeah, 5.5%. So right now we're looking at, you know, we are, as Ms. Martin, as Councillor Martin just stated, we are supposed to be advocating for all of Norfolk County here. And what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to find the savings that should be out there. And when we look at the fact that this ORO in every other municipality is a small uptake on a person's salary as opposed to being a $25,000 a month initiative, I think that that's a big deal. So if we saved 5% last year, while I appreciate some money should be going into a rate stabilization account, 5% is what we saved, and we're only raising 2.9% this year. I mean, that is a huge amount of money that has gone into another account. So for me as well, I mean, I look at this number should be somewhere at the most in the $100,000 to $150,000 range at the most. So I think for myself as well, I want to hear that staff followed council's direction, which was to go and to negotiate this agreement, to utilize the tools that we have available, i.e. management staff that is capable of holding the position at no additional cost to the county during the day, and that we look at other alternatives that are available for the people that are on the night pager system and adding this as an increase to their salary. It's good for our employees here in Norfolk County, and it's good for the ratepayers of Norfolk County. And the nominal increase that if we have to backdate it will be pennies on a volumetric basis. So I'll take the chair back. Councillor Taylor?
I thought staff said earlier in the day that much of the savings we experienced last year came from either cancellation of capital projects or finishing capital projects earlier than scheduled. I'd just like a little bit of clarification on that as to where some of that $500,000 came from.
I apologize. Councillor Taylor, can you please repeat your question?
I may have misheard earlier during this, but I thought much of the savings we experienced last year came from capital projects either being finished earlier than scheduled or cancellation of capital projects throughout the year. Just seeking clarification.
So if you were speaking of 2017's surplus, about approximately 260,000 was related to long-term debt, and then the remainder is it's a real mixed bag with material supplies and services. There's no real other major driver.
Thank you.
Further discussion? Okay, so we'll move to a vote. And if we could have a... Oh, I thought, did we not do it? That the motion to reduce the council-approved initiatives by $50,000 be deferred. It was moved by Councillor Martin. It was seconded by Councillor Michele. And if we could get a recorded vote, please.
So we'll go the other direction.
Sorry, Councillor Columbus.
Discussion on that, just to say that I cannot support the deferral. I support Councillor Taylor's motion, seconded by Councillor Rabbit's. Thanks.
So we'll go this way around this time. Councillor Taylor?
No.
Councillor Michele?
Yes.
Councillor Huffman?
No.
Councillor Van Passen? No. Councillor Martin?
Yes.
Councillor Columbus? No. Councillor Rabbits?
No.
Councillor Geisens? No. Mayor Chop?
Yes.
The motion is defeated.
Okay, so the next motion on the table was moved by Councillor Taylor and seconded by Councillor Rabbits that council-approved initiatives be reduced by 50,000. And any discussion on the floor? Okay, I'll pass. Oh, Councillor Rabbits.
Through the chair to staff, I just wanted to clarify. Yesterday we had said that this was within tolerable amounts to be cut from this, and I wanted to make sure that, you know, upon sober second thought, we've had a day elapse since those comments were made. If our staff still feel that what was said yesterday is still, you know, if we're still within a reasonable cut, or if this is something that they would not necessarily recommend, but is in within tolerable measures.
Mr. Cripps?
The truth is, at this exact moment, we can't know. But we can't get into the specifics of the instructions provided to us in closed session. We are attempting to comply. That involves exploration of new ways of doing business in which we are not in unilateral control. Forces beyond merely council wishes or management decisions. So it is impossible to give you an answer with certainty, but we did provide that number after some consultation with the senior leadership team as to what we think is doable. And this is our, at the time today, this is our best advice to you. Could we be wrong? Yes, but we think it's adequate, and there we are.
Councillor Martin.
As we move forward with the motion on the floor, I just would like to remind my colleagues, if you haven't had the opportunity to read the water and wastewater service delivery review that we were given yesterday, updated February 2018, page 6 of 12, weekend rounds are not specifically mandated in Ontario regulations, et cetera, et cetera. Therefore, weekend rounds could be cut back to 1 day on long weekends. This would reduce the weekend round cost of $75,600 to approximately $7,000, potential savings of approximately $68,600. So we're looking at addressing $50,000 off of this line. There's a report in front of us, given that we just received it and we have all been very busy. There's $68,000 worth of savings if we can investigate this other option.
Councillor Martin, if I could just interrupt you, I like where you're going with that. I think that would fall under the salaries line as opposed to the ORO new council or council approved initiative.
Okay, save that. Thank you.
Councillor Van Passen.
Yes, thank you, Madam Mayor. I'm in agreement with that. I'm comfortable reducing that amount by $50,000 because of the initiatives that you have talked about, as Councillor Martin has talked about. I have faith in staff that we'll be able to achieve those savings and much more. I'd be comfortable reducing it more than the 50, but that was the number recommended by staff. I don't have any worries that we will achieve our goals and then some. Thank you very much.
Councillor Huffman.
I just want to reiterate what Councillor Van Passen said. I concur. We had requested information. We were told, I understand, the end of January in terms of the negotiations regarding the ORO. I'm confident in staff that they will do the best that they can in terms of reducing those costs. I know we had spoken about, costs of pagers and weekend rounds and overtime and things like that. And again, comfortable with reducing it by 50,000, and I'd like to move forward as quickly as possible.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Huffman. Just to clarify again, the pagers and the weekend rounds, that's a separate issue than what we're discussing now. Councillor Columbus.
Mayor, if there are savings beyond $50,000, I would think they could be put into a reserve of some kind. I think that is doable.
If I could pass the chair back to Councillor Martin. I was actually going to make an amendment to the motion myself that council-approved initiatives be reduced by 50,000, and that if there is a further savings, that the money be credited back to the account to reduce the water and waste rates, as opposed to moving it into a rate stabilization account, that it should properly have not affected the rates this year. Would that be possible? Or it be applied next year as a, not, so that it doesn't go in a rate stabilization fund, that it actually be used to reduce the rates for the ratepayers. So next year, we should see that as an item, whatever that reduction was from 200,000.
Madam Mayor, if I understand what you're saying correctly, first of all, whatever we decide today, or if it falls over to another day, we have to send these amounts out to our contractor to bill out the ratepayers. So once the rates are set, they're set. So the following year, which you mentioned, so we would, in other words, if I can say back to you what I understand what you're saying, if we get, say, $50,000 in savings, then we would use that as a credit for the following year to reduce the rates. Is that how I'm understanding
Correct, as
it?
opposed to going into a rate stabilization account that they don't see any benefit, necessarily see any benefit from, or haven't seen any benefit from in some years.
Okay, that's something that we can do, absolutely.
Okay, I'll take the chair back. Any further discussion? Okay, so the motion that was moved by Councillor Martin, it was seconded by Councillor Michele, that the motion to reduce the council-approved initiatives by 50,000, sorry, it's the wrong one. That council, it was a motion moved by Councillor Taylor and seconded by Councillor Rabbits, that council-approved initiatives be reduced by 50,000, and my amendment that any further savings be credited to the water and waste rates in 2020. Councillor Van Passen.
Could I just ask the mover and seconder, are they making that as a friendly amendment and it just stays that way rather than, otherwise there's no seconder for your amendment? But
Can
they
I have
do
a
it as
seconder?
a friendly?
Well, just, Councillor Martin.
I think that's along the lines of what I was getting at. But.
Okay. Okay. Any further discussion? Okay, and all in favor? And unanimous. Can you make the adjustment? Next item. Councillor Martin, you raised a good point earlier.
Okay, so if we move to page 3.6, if we have no further questions related to page 3-5. Page 3-6 outlines the details for the water side of the house. The net levy rate requirement that's being requested is 8.7 million, 248,400 over last year's request. As James explained, you can see from the 2019, over the proposed 2019 over the proposed 2018 budget. Along the right-hand side of the columns are where the requests for increases and decreases. And you can see the major increase that we're looking at is the capital. I mentioned that yesterday, that one of the capital requirements for water, they're generally one-time items, and they're items that are within the capital plan that we have no available funding source at this time to fund it, so they'll come from the rate budget. So if anyone has any specific questions related to any of the line item details, we'd be happy to answer your questions.
Councillor Martin.
Would I be correct to refer back to this report when discussing salaries and benefits here?
Yes.
Yeah. So I'm not sure if staff has received all the copies. I know we handed one out to Mr. Baird yesterday. There is a water and wastewater delivery review that is a Norfolk County report that speaks to significant savings with regards to overtime, staff, pagers, weekends, et cetera, to the tune, and I'm only a few pages in here, and I have not read it in its entirety, but there are recommendations to immediately save $34,000, eventually $68,000. So I wonder if staff can speak to that on the salaries and benefits line and advise how we can address additional savings, incorporating some of these recommendations in the report. Any information would be helpful. Thank you.
Mayor Chop, if I could jump in. The report you're referring to, Councillor, is also known as the Walton Report. It has not been formally presented to Council, received as information or actioned. So I think that's really important. This is a great document. There's a lot of work put into it. But I think this Council should receive it, be able to digest it, and make some of those recommendations to staff that they be implemented. Some of them in here are just operational changes, and they can be done a bit more readily. But some of the other ones may be part of negotiated settlements that would require Mr. Slichenko's group and QP in this case to go through those. We may not be able to immediately benefit from those reductions, but at least it opens the way for some discussion. And I know there would be willingness on all sides to find some efficiencies.
I apologize for doing this right now, but I'd like to take a 5-minute break. There's a document that I'd like to retrieve.
Capital be done this afternoon? Oh, it's still on.